Have you ever stood in a church, heart pounding, only to realize the person you trusted most would never walk through those doors? Imagine being left at the altar, with whispers from the pews echoing louder than the vows you never got to speak. That was the reality for Ethan McGraw, a quiet cowboy of Willow Ridge who poured his whole soul into building a life only to have his bride vanish on the very day he needed her most. But what happens when, in the ashes of heartbreak, fate delivers a new choice? A woman he has never met steps into that same church, not with love on her lips, but with a contract in her hands. Would you risk opening your heart again, or would you guard it forever behind walls of silence? If it were you, could you learn to trust, to love, after being left so broken? This story isn't just about cattle, cabins, or contracts. It's about the choices we make when pain meets possibility. Stay with us, and let's walk into that church together. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you'll never miss the next story of love, loss, and redemption. The bell in Willow Ridge's weathered chapel tolled 3 times, its mournful sound drifting across the quiet frontier town. Inside, Ethan McGraw tugged at his string tie yet again, sweat beading on his brow from more than just the summer heat that pressed down through the open windows. He had been standing at the altar far too long, each minute stretching heavier than the last. The pews that once held sympathetic neighbors were nearly empty now, leaving only Reverend Harlan and his lifelong friend, Samuel Briggs. "She isn't coming." "Ethan," Samuel said gently, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Margaret Whitfield boarded the eastbound train this morning. Her father told me himself." Ethan shook his head, jaw set like stone. "No, she gave me her word." But as the old clock in the corner ticked on, the truth settled deep in his chest like choking dust. The banker's daughter he had courted for 2 long years had left him to face the altar alone. At last. Reverend Harlan cleared his throat, his voice worn with age. "Son, perhaps it's best we close this day." With his jaw clenched so tight it hurt, Ethan turned and strode down the aisle, boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. He passed by ribbons and flowers the townsfolk had gathered with such effort, now wasted. Outside, Willow Ridge bustled with afternoon business, yet whispers followed him. Pity and curiosity mingled in every glance. Ethan ignored them all and headed straight for the Rusty Spur Saloon, determined to bury his shame at the bottom of a glass. 6 long months crawled by after that bitter afternoon. Ethan drove himself into ranch work with merciless resolve, his hands raw and his spirit colder with each passing day. The winter of 1878 struck hard, snow piling higher than a man's shoulders, storms battering the land. Though his ranch endured, Ethan emerged hollow-eyed, carrying a heart that felt more like stone than flesh. He swore he would never again hand that heart to another soul. That vow nearly shattered when Samuel Briggs came calling the next spring. "Don't hit me before I finish," Samuel warned with both palms raised. "I'm not telling you to start courting again. But the Dawson homestead is going to auction since old man Dawson passed on. And the bank won't sell to a single man. They want stability. They want a family." Ethan scraped his hunting knife along a whetstone, scowling. "And what's that got to do with me?" Samuel leaned forward. "That pasture touches your land. The creek runs right through it. Double your herd if you get it. Mr. Caldwell at the bank said as much, but you'll need a wife to stand a chance against the mining companies." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "And where do you expect me to find a wife? Order one from a catalog." Samuel's reply was quiet but steady, a mail-order bride. That single suggestion set in motion a chain of letters, agreements, and arrangements, which is how Ethan McGraw found himself once more standing at the altar of Willow Ridge's only church on a spring morning in May of 1879. This time there were no flowers, no ribbons, no townsfolk crowding the pews. Only Ethan, Samuel, Reverend Harlan, and the echo of vows that were meant as nothing more than a business arrangement. "You sure about this?" Samuel whispered. Ethan gave one sharp nod. "She gets a home and safety. I get the Dawson property. Hearts stay out of it." The heavy church doors creaked, sunlight spilling in. Ethan squinted, expecting a plain, practical woman like the letters had described someone who knew her way around a household and a ranch. Instead, the figure who stepped through the doorway stole the air from his lungs. She wore a modest blue traveling dress, the dust of the stagecoach clinging to its hem. But no amount of dust could dull her presence. Auburn hair glinted in the light beneath a simple hat, framing a face of quiet strength and cautious intelligence. Green eyes swept the chapel before landing on him. The weight in Ethan's chest shifted. Something cracked. She walked down the aisle with calm resolve, stopping before him. "Mr. McGraw." Ethan managed a stiff nod. "Clara Whitmore," she said softly. "If we are to be married, you may as well use my given name." Reverend Harlan raised his worn Bible. "Shall we begin?" The words of the ceremony passed like shadows, distant and mechanical. Ethan repeated them without feeling, not until the moment he slid a plain gold band onto Clara's trembling hand. For the first time in nearly a year, his heart stirred against the stone he thought it had become. Clara's hand trembled just slightly as Ethan slid the plain gold band onto her finger. For an instant, he glimpsed something raw and unguarded in her green eyes, but she quickly veiled it with composure. The preacher's words faded into silence, and a few quick signatures on the certificate sealed a contract that was meant to be nothing more than practical. And yet, as Ethan led Clara down the steps of Willow Ridge's little chapel, he could not shake the strange weight pressing against his ribs. He had a wife now, though she was little more than a stranger. The wagon stood waiting in front of the church, loaded with sacks of flour, coffee, and other supplies. Clara climbed up onto the bench beside him with quiet dignity, her small carpetbag and one travel trunk tied securely in the back. For a long while they rode in silence, the wheels rattling over the ruts of the dirt road. The May sun beat down, and meadowlarks called from the fence posts. It was Clara who finally broke the quiet. "Your letters never mention just how large your holdings are." Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead. 3,000 acres, he said evenly. Around 2,500 head of cattle. 10 hired men live in the bunkhouse and help me keep the herd fed and the fences standing. She nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the scale of his words. Her gaze swept the valley that opened before them as the team of horses pulled the wagon up a rise. Below stretched the McGraw spread, a patchwork of grassland and corrals, barns and the main house sitting solid on a knoll. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Built the house myself 3 years back. It's 2 stories, 3 bedrooms. You can choose one upstairs. I'll keep the small one off the kitchen." Something flickered across Clara's face, relief, perhaps, or the shadow of disappointment. He could not read her expression and decided not to ask. "I appreciate your consideration," she replied with formality. "I know this is a matter of practicality. Mr. McGraw." She paused, then corrected herself softly. "Ethan, but I do hope we might treat one another with courtesy at the very least." Ethan inclined his head. "I won't make your life harder than it has to be. You do your share, I'll do mine." As the wagon rattled into the yard, the house came into full view. The two-story structure of timber and stone stood strong against the wide horizon, its porch wrapping around like open arms. To Ethan's eyes, it had always seemed too quiet, too empty, waiting for a life that never came. For 6 long months he had lived there alone, with only the echo of his own footsteps. Now another presence was about to cross its threshold. He jumped down and offered his hand to Clara. Her waist felt fragile beneath his grip as he helped her from the wagon. She took in the house with measured curiosity as he led her inside. The main room held sturdy furniture he had chosen with little eye for beauty, but plenty for usefulness. Clara's gaze traveled over the clean lines of the chairs and the stone hearth. "It's lovely," she said, and he believed she meant it. "My mother always said a home should be comfortable, but not fussy." Ethan replied before he could stop himself. He regretted sharing even that small piece of memory. Clara brushed her fingers along the back of a chair. "She gave you wise counsel." He showed her through the rest of the house, ending upstairs where 2 neat bedrooms waited. "Take whichever you like," he said. "The washroom's at the end of the hall. I had water piped in from the spring last year." Her brows rose in mild surprise. "That is quite modern for a place this far from town." Ethan shrugged. "I don't mind working hard for comfort." He cleared his throat. "I'll bring up your trunk. Supper's at 6, leaving her to settle in." Ethan felt strangely like a guest in his own house. That evening, when the smell of roasting beef drifted from the kitchen, he sat at the table and found himself staring at plates far finer than his usual fare. Clara moved with practiced ease, serving potatoes and warm bread, the crust golden from the oven. He took a bite and nearly closed his eyes at the taste. "This is good," he said at last, the words rough but sincere. She inclined her head. "Thank you. I worked as a cook's assistant for a time in St. Louis before making my way west." Ethan looked up sharply. "Your letters only mentioned housekeeping. I was both at different times." She set down her fork. Her posture stiffened, as though bracing herself. "I suppose you wonder why a woman from St. Louis would agree to wed a stranger out here." He shrugged, though curiosity gnawed at him. "Your past is yours to tell or not." "I believe honesty will serve us better," she said firmly. Then, gathering courage, she continued. "My father died 2 years ago, leaving debts I could never hope to repay. I found whatever work I could, but in the city a woman without family, dowry, or powerful friends is easily overlooked. When my employer's son began pressing unwanted attention, I knew I had to leave before matters grew worse." Ethan's grip tightened on his fork. "Did he harm you?" "No," she answered quickly. "I left before it came to that. But I had nowhere left to turn. Your advertisement seemed plain-spoken. You sought a wife for practical purposes. I sought security and a new beginning. It felt like a fair bargain." Ethan studied her across the lamplight and nodded slowly. "It is fair. Later." As he lay in his downstairs room, he listened to the unfamiliar sounds above the creak of floorboards, the closing of a drawer, the soft fall of footsteps. Small things, yet they filled the emptiness that had haunted the house for so long. For the first time in months, the silence was broken not by wind rattling shutters, but by the presence of another soul. Before dawn he rose, as he always did, to begin the day's work. To his surprise, the scent of strong coffee already filled the kitchen, mingling with the hiss of bacon in a skillet. Clara stood at the stove, sleeves rolled neatly, moving with confidence. "You're up early," Ethan remarked, pouring himself a cup. It was stronger and richer than anything he had ever brewed. "I thought you'd be starting soon," she replied, turning a slice of bacon with practiced ease. "Ranch work doesn't wait for the sun, does it?" Something unexpected warmed in Ethan's chest. No, it surely doesn't. Over the following weeks, a rhythm settled between them as naturally as sunrise. Ethan worked long days with his men, driving cattle and repairing fences, while Clara tended the house. Bit by bit she changed its atmosphere. Curtains appeared where there had been bare windows. A quilt from her trunk was draped across the sofa. She polished the dining table until it gleamed, and fresh herbs from a small garden began to flavor their meals. Ethan pretended not to notice, but each quiet touch eased a little of the hardness inside him. The ranch house no longer felt like a shell of timber and stone. It was beginning, in some subtle way, to feel like a home. The men noticed as well. Hank and Rosie, who had worked for Ethan through the hard winter, commented that the boss's place looked more welcoming these days. Ethan brushed off their remarks, but he caught them tipping their hats respectfully whenever Clara passed. And in the evenings, when the day's dust settled, Ethan found himself looking forward to sitting at his own table again, where conversation sometimes stretched beyond the weather or the herd. Clara had a sharp mind and a way of speaking that made him listen, even when he tried to keep his walls high. He still told himself this was just an arrangement. Yet the sound of her voice, the warmth of coffee waiting before dawn, and the quilt spread across the sofa whispered otherwise. The stone around his heart had not broken yet, but hairline cracks were forming, and he could feel something alive stirring within. In the weeks that followed their wedding, Ethan and Clara settled into a routine. They spoke politely, sometimes even with easy humor, but both were careful not to cross the invisible line of their arrangement. At night, when the house grew still, Ethan often found his thoughts drifting upstairs to the woman who slept above him. It wasn't only longing that stirred in him, though he was not blind to her beauty. It was curiosity, too, the kind that wondered what dreams she carried, what memories she kept hidden behind that calm expression. About a month later, Ethan returned from Willow Ridge with news that shifted the course of his work. Over supper, as Clara set a basket of warm biscuits on the table, he looked up and said, "The bank accepted my bid on the Dawson homestead. I signed the papers next week." Clara's eyes lit, and for once her smile reached every corner of her face. "That's wonderful. Ethan, congratulations." He nodded, then admitted, "It's thanks to you. They wouldn't have considered me otherwise." Her smile faltered a little, softening into something quieter. "I'm glad our bargain has served its purpose." The word struck Ethan harder than he expected. "That came out wrong," he said quickly. "I only meant I'm grateful. You moved across half the country, married a stranger, and stepped into a hard life without complaint." She lifted her chin with quiet strength. "And you've kept every promise you made, a fair exchange." Their talk soon shifted to pastures, cattle counts, and water rights. But Ethan carried with him a strange ache, as if something important had been left unsaid. The following Sunday, for the first time since their vows, they walked together into Willow Ridge's church. Ethan could feel the eyes on them, could hear the low hum of whispers as they stepped down the aisle to a pew. Clara's hand rested lightly on his arm, steady and sure, her head held high. After the service, women from town approached her, eager to introduce themselves. Invitations to quilting circles and socials followed, and Clara met each one with the same poise she carried into every room. Ethan stood a few paces away, watching. She was finding her place here far quicker than he ever had in 5 years. "Your wife's making quite an impression," Samuel Briggs murmured, coming to stand beside him. "She has a way with people," Ethan admitted, "and you." "How's married life treating you?" Samuel asked with a sly smile. Ethan shrugged, eyes on Clara. "It's practical." Samuel raised a brow. "Practical. Huh. That why you've been watching her like she might vanish if you so much as blink?" Ethan scowled. "It's not like that." "Sure it ain't," Samuel said with a chuckle. "Just like you didn't spend half the morning at Davenport's store picking out that silver hairpin I saw her wearing today." Heat crept up Ethan's neck. The truth was, he had bought the pin on impulse, a small piece of silver with a single pearl that had reminded him of the clear tone of Clara's skin. He'd left it on her dresser without a word, convincing himself it was no more than a gesture of gratitude. "You're reading too much into things," Ethan muttered. "Maybe you're not reading enough," Samuel replied, clapping him on the shoulder before walking off. Summer rolled in, bringing long, punishing days. With the new property added to his holdings, Ethan worked harder than ever, driving his men to cut fire breaks, mend fences, and manage the larger herd. For the first time in years, he felt the ranch was thriving, and inside the house, something quieter but no less real was thriving too. Evenings often found Ethan and Clara sitting on the porch, plates balanced on their laps as the sun slid down behind the ridges. They spoke more freely in those hours, sometimes about ranch accounts and cattle, other times about books Clara had read or the politics she had followed back in St. Louis. Ethan found himself listening, truly listening, to her opinions. She spoke with knowledge, with the calm authority of someone raised by a father who believed education belonged to daughters as much as sons. Before his financial ruin, he had given her every book and lesson he could manage. And now, on a porch in Wyoming territory, she passed that richness along. One evening, as the sky burned orange, Ethan said quietly, "Doesn't seem right. You had all that learning, only to end up cooking and cleaning for a cowboy." Clara turned, her profile caught in the golden light. "Is that all you think you are? Just a cowboy?" He shrugged. "That's how I started. Saved what I could. Built this spread with little more than grit and mule-headed stubbornness. That's exactly what I mean," she said softly. "You've built something remarkable here, Ethan. My education isn't wasted. I use it every day, keeping the accounts, planning improvements, finding ways to stretch what we have." She hesitated, almost shy. "Unless you'd rather I left that to you." "No," he said quickly, leaning forward. "I'm grateful. Numbers never were my strong suit." Her smile in that moment stirred something in him deeper than he cared to name. Each day it grew harder to remember why he had sworn to keep his heart locked away. But in late July, all the small steps they had made toward one another were tested. A lightning storm rolled over the mountains, cracking the sky wide open. Dry grasses caught like tinder, and within hours a wildfire was racing down the slopes toward the valley. Ethan and his hands fought desperately, driving cattle into safer pastures, cutting fire lines, and beating at flames with wet sacks. The wind shifted without warning, and the fire turned toward the ranch house itself. Ethan's chest clenched when he realized Clara was still inside. She had insisted earlier on gathering family papers, deeds, and a few heirlooms. Now, smoke was curling above the roof line. He spurred his horse hard, fear clawing at his throat as he rode through the haze. Every sound of crackling flame was like the ticking of a clock counting down. If he didn't reach her in time, the thought alone nearly broke him. He leaned low in the saddle, urging his horse faster, praying he would not arrive too late. By the time Ethan crested the ridge, smoke choked the air and turned the late summer sky a bruised orange. For one heart-stopping instant, he thought the ranch house was already burning. Then, through the haze, he saw her. Clara stood in the yard, skirt smudged, shouting orders to two ranch hands as they hauled water from the well to douse the roof and siding. Relief slammed into him so suddenly he nearly slipped from the saddle. He swung down and rushed toward her. Clara's face was streaked with soot, her hair half fallen from its pins, but her eyes were lit with determination. "The western line is holding," she called, her voice hoarse but steady. "I sent Jeb and Louise to shore it up." Ethan wanted nothing more than to drag her into his arms and keep her safe. But instead, he snapped, "You should have gone to town. Left this place behind." She shook her head hard, ash falling like dark snow. "Not a chance. This is our home." The word struck him in the chest like a hammer blow. Our, not his, not hers, but theirs. Together they worked through the night, hauling buckets, smothering sparks, beating at creeping flames with wet sacks. Sweat and smoke burned Ethan's eyes, but he barely noticed. Side by side with Clara, he fought harder than he ever had for cattle or land. And by dawn, against the odds, they won. The fire lay beaten, leaving behind blackened fields and scorched fence posts, but the ranch house still stood. They leaned against the porch rail, filthy and trembling with exhaustion. Without thinking, Ethan reached for her hand. Clara laced her fingers through his. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night, too weary to climb the stairs, they collapsed onto the settee in the parlor. Clara's head found his shoulder as though it had always belonged there. Ethan stayed still for a long time, memorizing the feel of her against him. At some point, she drifted into sleep, careful as if handling glass. He lifted her and carried her upstairs. As he laid her on her bed, she stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Stay," she whispered, catching his hand before he could draw back. His throat tightened. "Clara, I don't want to cross a line." "You're not," she murmured. I don't want to be alone tonight." So he stayed, stretched out above the covers, their hands entwined. The rhythm of her breathing eased him into the first peaceful sleep he'd known in years. August came, hotter than any summer Ethan could remember. The land cracked beneath the sun. Cattle grew restless in the dust, and the air between Ethan and Clara seemed charged with the same pressure as a storm about to break. They continued their routines, shared meals, and touched in passing more often than before. Yet neither spoke of the night after the fire. Ethan found himself inventing excuses to be near her, a question about the ledger, a comment about the garden, anything to linger. And yet, when the closeness threatened to unravel the careful distance he had sworn to keep, he'd retreat into silence. One blistering afternoon, he returned unexpectedly from a supply run, intending to grab a forgotten ledger. He found Clara in the back garden, her dress damp with sweat as she knelt among rows of tomatoes. Stray tendrils of auburn hair clung to her neck. She looked up, shading her eyes. "You're back early," she said. "Forgot some papers." He managed, though he couldn't look away. "You shouldn't be out in this heat. The tomatoes won't wait." She smiled faintly, holding up a plump red fruit. "Besides, I'm sturdier than I look." He stepped closer and reached for the basket. Their fingers brushed, and the jolt that passed between them nearly undid him. Clara's breath caught. "Ethan," she said softly, her eyes steady on his. We need to talk about what's happening between us." He swallowed, trying to find ground that wasn't crumbling beneath him. "What do you think is happening? Something neither of us planned." Her voice was quiet, but unwavering. "Something more than an arrangement." He set the basket down slowly. "I gave you my word. Separate lives under one roof. And if I don't want that anymore—" Her words were barely above a whisper. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them standing in the garden. The Wyoming sun beating down, the air shimmering with heat. Ethan took a step closer, close enough to see freckles across her nose. The small scar near her brow he'd never noticed before. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, voice rough. Her answer was simple, and it shattered the last of his defenses. "I want a real marriage. I want you." The dam inside him broke. He drew her into his arms and kissed her, pouring months of longing into that one moment. She kissed him back fiercely, her hands gripping his shoulders as if she feared he might vanish. When at last they broke apart, both breathless, he leaned his forehead against hers. "I've been fighting this since the day you walked into that church," he confessed. "Why fight it?" she whispered. "Because the last time I stood at an altar, I was left humiliated and alone. I swore I'd never risk it again." Understanding flickered in her gaze. The town gossip was true then. "You were engaged once before." Ethan nodded, the old bitterness rising like smoke from smoldering coals. "Margaret Whitfield, banker's daughter. She promised me forever, then boarded a train east and never looked back." Clara cupped his cheek with her hand, her touch achingly gentle. "I'm not Margaret." "No," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You're nothing like her. You're braver, stronger. And whether I like it or not, I'm falling in love with you." A smile spread across her face, bright and sure. "I already love you, Ethan McGraw." That night, he carried his belongings upstairs and laid them in the master bedroom. When they came together as husband and wife in truth for the first time, it was tender and raw, filled with both passion and wonder. Later, tangled in the quiet afterglow, Ethan traced patterns along her shoulder. "When did you know?" he asked. She thought a moment before answering. "The hairpin. You noticed what would suit me, and left it for me without a word. That was when I realized this was more than business." He smiled faintly. "For me, it was the morning after our wedding, when I came down and found coffee brewing before dawn. Nobody had ever thought of me that way before, but I didn't let myself admit it until the fire, when I thought I might lose you." Clara leaned into him, eyes shining, then no more pretending. Ethan kissed her again, knowing she was right. Ethan's chest tightened as he spoke aloud the name he had tried to bury. "Margaret Whitfield, the banker's daughter. She left me standing at the altar like I was nothing more than a hired hand." His voice was rough with old shame. Clara reached up, her palm warm against his cheek. "I am not Margaret," she said softly but firmly. He caught her hand and kissed it. "No, you're not. You're braver, stronger. And somehow, against my will, I've gone and fallen in love with you." Her smile was like dawn breaking after a storm. "I love you too, Ethan McGraw. I think I have for longer than I realized." That night he carried his things into the master bedroom, not as an employer or a man bound by a bargain, but as a husband choosing his wife. What followed was no arrangement, but the quiet unfolding of love, hesitant at first, then sure, like water finding its course through stone. As dawn broke, Ethan traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder and asked, "When did you know this was more than necessity?" Clara thought a moment before answering, "The hairpin. Not just that you bought it, but that you noticed what would suit me. That told me you saw me as more than a stranger." He smiled faintly. "For me, it was the morning after our wedding. You had coffee brewing before I came downstairs. No one had ever thought of my needs like that before. It wasn't the coffee, Clara. It was what it meant." She laughed softly, resting her head against him. By the time September came, life at the ranch had shifted. Ethan and Clara traveled together to Cheyenne to finalize the purchase of the Dawson homestead. What had once been a practical errand turned into something else entirely, a honeymoon they never admitted they needed. Ethan took pleasure in showing Clara the bustle of the growing town, the theater lights, the fine restaurants, the shops where she lingered over fabrics and books. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she moved with the easy joy of a woman unburdened. Her laughter rang through the cobblestone streets, and Ethan found himself grinning more in those days than in all the years since he'd built his ranch from nothing. When they returned to Willow Ridge, the crisp bite of autumn in the air, their bond was unshakable. Even the ranch hands, who had once kept their distance from the woman they quietly called the bride from back east, began tipping their hats with real affection. They had seen the change in their boss, a man once stern and silent, now softer, quicker to smile. By Christmas, Clara had news that would alter their lives forever. She told him by the fire, her cheeks flushed from the glow of the flames. "Ethan," she said, her hands trembling just slightly as she reached for his, "I'm going to have a child." For a moment he only stared, stunned into silence. Then joy surged through him like a flood. He pulled her into his arms, laughter breaking from him unrestrained. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." Tears pricked Clara's eyes at the raw wonder in his expression. She had seen Ethan battle fire and hardship without flinching, but here was a different side of him, unshielded, vulnerable, overwhelmed with gratitude. Through the long winter, they planned for the future. Ethan fussed over her more than she thought necessary, scolding her gently if she lifted a bucket or worked too long in the kitchen. She teased him, but inside she felt cherished in a way she had never known. One evening, as snow blanketed Willow Ridge and the world lay hushed beneath white, they sat before the hearth. Ethan's hand rested protectively over her still flat belly, his thumb tracing absent circles. "When I agreed to marry you," Claire confessed, "I thought I was being practical. I told myself it was a way to secure my future." He smiled, pulling her closer. "And instead I found everything I didn't even know I was looking for." He kissed the top of her head. "If I regret anything, it's the months I wasted keeping you at arm's length because I was too afraid of losing again." His voice grew quiet. "But now I thank God every day that you walked into that church." Spring came early in 1880, and with it, a day that changed everything once more. Nearly a year to the day after she had first stepped nervously into the small church of Willow Ridge. Clara returned there, but not as a stranger entering into a bargain. This time, the pews were filled with neighbors, ranch hands, and townsfolk who had come to witness what the whole valley already knew. Ethan and Clara were bound not by necessity, but by love. Clara walked down the aisle, her green eyes bright with happiness, her hands gently cradling the swell of their child. Ethan waited at the front, his heart hammering as though he were the nervous groom again. Only now, the fear that had once haunted him was gone. When she reached him, he took her hands in his marveling once more at the miracle of her presence. "Ready," he whispered. Her smile was radiant. "I've been ready since the day I met you," she replied, as they renewed their vows this time, not as strangers agreeing to survive, but as husband and wife declaring love before God and community. Ethan's gaze never wavered from Clara's face. What had begun as a desperate bargain had grown into the deepest love of his life. Proof, Ethan thought as he drew her into his arms after the ceremony, that sometimes the heart finds its home not where we expect it, but where we are willing to risk everything to begin again, and for the rest of his days. Whenever he passed that little church in Willow Ridge, he silently gave thanks for the twist of fate that had once left him waiting at the altar alone, because that very moment had opened the door to the greatest gift he would ever know. At its heart, Ethan and Clara's story is not about land or cattle or even the vows spoken in church. It is about how two people, scarred by disappointment, dared to try again. Many of us know what it feels like to lose, whether it was the love of a spouse, the trust of a friend, or the dreams of our youth. The easy path is to close ourselves off, to believe that nothing new can grow in the soil of old heartbreak. But this story reminds us that sometimes love comes when we least expect it. What begins as a matter of necessity can blossom into something sacred if we allow patience, kindness, and courage to guide us. Ethan found that his greatest fear, being hurt again, was the very barrier keeping him from joy. And Clara discovered that her worth did not depend on her past, but on the love she chose to give. For those of us in the autumn of our lives, it is a gentle reminder it is never too late to open the heart. Trust can be rebuilt, joy rediscovered, and love can still surprise us even after the hardest winters. Thank you, dear friends, for sharing your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll keep these timeless tales of love and second chances alive.